So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to have a kind of look at in today's session. So we're going to think about how context informs your methodology. Kirsty's going to talk to you about that. And we've got a couple of fun activities for that section. And then we're going to have a look at the relationship between research questions and research approaches. And then we're going to have a think about how we demonstrate reflections on our chosen methods. That's a really important part of writing your methodology. And especially once you're kind of at level 7 and above, you need to be really showing that you've really got to grips with your methods in quite a sophisticated way that goes beyond simply spelling out, these are the advantages of this method and these are the disadvantages. It's kind of about developing that further, and we'll give some examples of that towards the end of the session. So I just want to begin today by showing you this kind of research framework, which I've borrowed from one of my lecturers, and I think it's a really helpful way of illustrating the whole process of the methodology and research, and it sort of formed a bit of the inspiration for today's session for me. And I don't want us to kind of get too hung up on trying to pick apart everything, but I think there are a few things that it's worth highlighting from this about showing how you've got research context, and I'm not going to talk much about that because that's going to be very much Kirsty kind of in the next few slides, but your context comes to inform your research questions, and then there's this really clear relationship between your research questions and your methodology, and then your methodology comes to inform your methods, and then you've got all of these offshoots from that you know, the different tools that you can actually use to collect your data. And then once you've got this data, there's the process that we won't get to talking about today, but of analyzing it and then actually writing up your discussion section, coming out with conclusions, recommendations. But I really like this because it kind of shows that the whole relationship is almost kind of a cycle, because ultimately your conclusions will come back to, have you answered your research questions? And in terms of your methodology is all about, have I created the best environment situation to answer my research questions? So I just wanted to show you this as kind of a way of illustrating the whole research process and yeah, trying to highlight why methodology is important and how it fits in the wider picture of your research. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Kirsty to start talking to you about research context.
Great, thank you. So yeah, what we're going to pause on and think about first of all in this session is, how does research context and the environments that our research projects emerge from, how can that influence our methodology, and how can it actually begin to guide us and give us some clues as to how we should structure that methodology and our projects more generally? So what I'd say is, in order to think about research context, think of this as the research setting. So it's an environment or a social reality that your project emerges from. So there's that kind of lived reality, there's that context environment that perhaps gives rise to a problem that your research project wants to answer. It's perhaps sparked off a kind of a thought for you, and you're thinking about the ways in which your project kind of might instigate change in that context. But projects don't just kind of emerge to us out of nowhere. They have that kind of grounding in some kind of reality, whether that is from the theory, whether that is a professional context. We've got that kind of background there. So when we think about context, first of all, think about how context informs your research project. Often different contexts and different environments have social rules, they have conventions, and that might inform the kind of project that we want to write. For example, if the context that your project emerges from is a professional context, there are certain projects that would be more useful to that context than others. For example, writing, maybe a policy report, a policy analysis, coming up with recommendations for practice. Those types of approaches are more suited to that professional context than others. So we can help use that environment, help use that context to inform and give us some ideas about what's the most appropriate way to answer that question, or what's the most appropriate format for that dissertation. Context can also ensure relevance. So actually, by writing a project and writing a dissertation that is firmly grounded in some kind of context or setting, helps us to make a case for it being worthwhile and for it being relevant. And that's really important in that introduction. If you can spell out a rationale and a meaning for that project to exist, it has to have a reason behind it. Context can help you to do that because it can help to show how your research is plugged into the real world, how it maybe impacts that context in the end. Context also allows us to set scope, and what I mean by this is we can almost protect ourselves with the scope of our research by being very clear and confident about what we do want to do, but also about what we don't want to do and about what we're not interested in. So in other words, we're kind of covering ourselves here from criticism in many ways, because if you write, for example, a very theoretically based dissertation, the context is theoretical, you're working with literature, your aims and objectives are all focused on making that theoretical contribution. Someone can't then read your dissertation and say, well, it's okay, but one criticism I have is it doesn't apply to professional practice. Because we can actually say, well, let's go back and trace back through that research framework, and actually from a contextual level through to the research objectives and questions, at every single stage, the focus has been on this theoretical contribution. So it allows us to be really confident and clear about what we are aiming to do and the areas that we're perhaps not interested in contributing to. And that's something you can come back to in the conclusion to measure your success and show what you have achieved in the scope and in the lane that you've set for yourself. So that's the ways that context can inform the design of our research project. Research projects, though, it's also worth thinking about, particularly at this stage at master's level. That research project, if it's emerged from a context, doesn't then exist in a vacuum. If we're measuring the success of our projects, if we're thinking about what we've been able to contribute through writing our dissertations, it's important to think about the ways it maybe fits back into that environment or impacts that social reality in some way. So, for example, a research project has proposed change, and it has implications. It's going to have an impact. That could be an impact on a setting. It could be an impact on a group of participants. But it's very unusual that our outcomes draw a line under that research project. So it's often that there's this two-way relationship with context. It gives us purpose. It gives us ideas for our research projects. But when there's that close relationship, we also have to accept that our research project will feed back into that context. It can't be treated as wholly independent from it. It's worth thinking about that in the findings and the conclusion section, how successful your project has been and whether or not it has the potential to impact and to contribute to that research context. So we want to acknowledge how context informs our methodology. We also want to be honest and acknowledge the ways in which that context feeds right through to the findings and conclusions of our dissertations. But also think about in your project, how do these contexts interact with each other? And actually, through your project and through your dissertation, are you bringing together contexts that are otherwise completely separate or are distinct in some way? If you can do that, if you can notice those moments where there is intersection between contexts, it's a great chance to be critical. Okay, so in terms of your critical writing, anytime you've got more than one factor, you've got this kind of push and pull of these different contexts, that's a great opportunity in your writing to really pick apart that relationship. Maybe start to understand which context has a greater impact than the other. Do they share similarities or are there distinct differences? So to give you an example, I was talking to a student this week about her undergrad dissertation, and she was looking at social work, and she was looking at how is decision-making influenced for social workers? So what's their decision-making process based on? And her contexts were kind of mixed together because she had this professional context. She was dealing with a lot of papers around professional practice. There were lots of guidelines and recommendations for social workers. But she was also conducting interviews where she'd done a work placement, which was at a social work kind of organisation in Sheffield. And in that particular office and in that organisation, there were very kind of local issues that the team were focusing on. There were also issues around funding, staffing, the different kind of metrics that her managers wanted her to focus on. So there was a real clash of context there. There's the professional realm, but then there's also this kind of specific local focus to their work as well. And that project needed to understand where was the intersection between those two things? Where were the professional guidelines neatly fitting into her local experience? But where were there also tensions? And if that was the case, ultimately, if she was interested in decision making for those social workers, which context for them was at the forefront of their mind? Which context was actually kind of the most influential in terms of their practice and decision making? So being able to pick apart and understand that relationship is a great opportunity to be critical, rather than as just being superficial and acknowledging the existence of these two worlds. We want to think about how those two worlds might sometimes come into conflict with one another and how they might interact in some way. So just to kind of pause and talk to you in a little bit more detail about some of the questions you can ask yourself to really pick apart this. And as Matt says, at kind of level 7 writing, we want to have that quite sort of nuanced kind of presentation of context and how it links through to our methods and methodology. First of all, we want to think, how does the setting for the project help to justify the relevance of that dissertation? Again, if we can ground our projects in a social reality, we'll be able to show that they are needed, that they're worthwhile. Also think about what restrictions that context places on your project. So it might impose restrictions in terms of the format of the dissertation. It might impose restrictions in terms of your participants and how you can speak to them. For example, if you're working in an area where there's a lot of kind of issues, what's the word I'm looking for? Sensitive issues, maybe things that need to be kept confidential. It's worth thinking about, okay, realistically then, how can I speak to these participants? What's an appropriate way to do that? How can I keep those participants safe and keep their information confidential? So there will be some restrictions that maybe come out of the context that you work in. But don't think of restrictions as always a bad thing. I think sometimes if you're limited, it does give you focus and it does give you a clear remit in an area to kind of work in. Think about as well what resources and participants the context gives you access to. This is all about being realistic in terms of the planning and methodology for your projects. You may have an ideal number in mind, you may have ideal participants in mind, but in order to instill change and have an impact on a particular context, you may have to work with participants or who you can find in that particular area. One thing to really think about is how you can plan to manage your role in that context. So some of us, I think someone mentioned being both a PhD student and an architect, straddling both those realms, and you've got roles to play in each of those. So if you're in your place of work researching, how do you manage your role in that context? Because you are both an insider and an external observer. So it's worth thinking about your positionality. Also, it might be you share particular characteristics with your participants. So for example, if your dissertation wants to impact a particular group of people, make their lives better or make something easier for them, are you also implicated in that change? Are you a member of that participant group? So Emily asked, could these questions form part of the discussion section? I think absolutely. I think some of them you could think about as early on as in the introduction, particularly if context has a strong influence on the subsequent design of your methodology. I think you could deal with it a little bit earlier on. I think in the discussion section is a really good time to actually pause and look at these in more detail. I don't know what you would say to that, Matt. Kind of where would you maybe deal with this? Do you think it could be spread across different sections?
I do, because I think in many ways your discussion is sort of a mirror to your introduction and literature review, in that it inverts these questions. You might be looking at them kind of thinking about in terms of recommendations, implications, and then the role of context becomes really important again for all of the reasons that you've been talking about. If you want to use the example from kind of the social worker that you were talking about before, again, if they choose to say use a context that heavily preferences the very local setting, that obviously does add value to the project in some ways, because it makes it much more relevant for those social workers in this local setting. However, when it comes to your discussion, you need to revisit these questions, because actually the focus that you've brought to your project means that you've sacrificed potentially wider applicability because you've dealt with very local concerns. So I would say these questions are, you almost always want to have them in mind, both as a setup for your methodology and then when you come to write your discussion. Yeah,
I think as well, sometimes what I've found helpful is to think about that notion of the dissertation telling a story, and you're in charge of that story, you're the one telling it. And I think figuring out, giving readers information at the point of need. So figuring out in your write-up, what's the point of need for that reader in terms of understanding the context? If they need it off the back to really appreciate the relevance and the need for this project and the relevance of your research questions to kind of reality for a particular group of participants, I would mention them early. If, however, you think context isn't playing such a huge role and it's more interesting to bring it into the discussion, that's their point of need. Once they've seen the lit review, they've seen the findings, then you could bring it in later. So I think, yeah, it's definitely thinking about revealing it at the point at which it's most impactful and it makes most sense to that storytelling. Because if you don't introduce it until later on, they might have missed an opportunity to appreciate its importance and relevance at the start of that project, if that makes sense. Okay. When we get through then to the kind of discussion and conclusion section, it's also worth starting to think about how the project reflects back. So Matt, you used that sort of image of a mirror, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. How does the project reflect back on the context that it was originally kind of emerged from? So it's useful to think about context in terms of, does it allow us to measure the success of our project? If that dissertation set out to influence, change, impact participants in a positive way, have you been able to do that? And you might think about how other researchers could take your work forwards and expand it in that context itself. It could be that the success of your project lies elsewhere. Perhaps it lies more in the data that you've been able to generate, perhaps in synthesizing new literature in the literature review. And that's absolutely fine. So just think about what your project has contributed. That's what we're always trying to decide at the end. What's the kind of future life of that dissertation once you print it and it's finished? Where could it have most impact? Who could it be of importance to? I mentioned earlier as well in the conclusion, acknowledging the scope of the project and being very honest about what lies outside of your interests. You don't need to write a project that is of interest and impact to absolutely everyone. You will have a very distinct aim in mind, and you'll have a sector that you perhaps want to contribute to. And that's fine. I think it's good to be confident about that, because as Matt will talk through later, that can help you to make a lot of informed decisions about the methods that you then use. Lastly, though, do think about, is your context unique? Or are there characteristics that are shared with other areas? Because if that's the case, you could start to make claims for your project having transferability. It could even come out with findings and results that are generalizable. So some people will work in very niche contexts, but others may be working in an area, for example, one of those professional contexts or a theoretical area, say. And that theoretical context could actually impact several different disciplines. It could have implications for several different fields of study. Future research students from across different departments could use that theory in different ways. So think about whether that context is unique, because if it does share aspects or features with others, that helps you make some claims for that life of your project beyond the end of the dissertation in terms of how it might be transferred or made more generalized. Okay, so what we'd like you to do now is just pop back to your Menti tab, and you'll see that there is a new question displayed at the moment. If you've closed that tab, don't worry, you can go back to menti.com in a new window, and again, just insert that code. So 883452 is your code to access. And there's a new question on there, and all we'd like you to do now is just submit your answers to rank the importance of context for your project, because we appreciate that for some people this might be something they've not spent much time thinking about before. For others, they will have a very strong research context and that strong kind of ethos to their work. So if you just want to hop over to Menti, you'll see there are 4 statements, and we'd just like you to indicate how far you agree or disagree with each of those statements. And I'll share that on the screen as well so that we can see the results coming through. This is really interesting to see how it kind of changes and whether or not there's any sort of key trends in the whole group. Interesting to see how these change. So the highest one at the moment just is that a lot of people saying that their research problem is strongly connected to a context or community, which is fantastic. I think that opens up lots of possibilities for the methodology, lots of ways to really strongly connect that research context right the way through the project as that central story that you're telling, or that central narrative.
I'd say I find it great that we've got 3.8 for my findings have the potential to change an environment or context as well. I think that's really, really positive.
Yeah. I think sometimes just being able to see that is quite, like, that should instill confidence. I think one of the things that I always worried about when I was writing for my PhD, I was a bit like, who is going to care about this? You know, like, have I gone off into a really theoretical niche area that people aren't interested in? And I think now it's easier to look back and appreciate the changes or the environments that it might have had an impact on. So I think if you can spend a bit of time thinking about this now, it helps build that confidence, that bit of faith as you do your write-up. And yeah, playing an active role in the context of the project. That's always an interesting one to think about. If you are both an insider in a context, but you're also having this dual role as a researcher at master's level, it's interesting to think about how that might influence things like bias, how you might be using your inside connections and your knowledge of that area in a way that would not be obvious to other researchers. You might have a good working knowledge of how things kind of function in that context. You might already have sort of ready access to participants. So it's well worth pausing in your methodology and thinking about, how does playing that active role impact your project? How has it led you to make certain decisions that perhaps an outsider wouldn't have been able to make? Brilliant. Okay. So that's really interesting. It just gives us a snapshot as to, I think, some of those key statements to be thinking about in terms of your research context, but it's also nice to just see the spread across different participants to see if anyone has got these kind of shared similarities or these common features for their dissertations. It's also kind of a useful point, I think, of reflection, because we don't expect you to come to these sessions having already thought about a lot of this stuff. I think one of mine and Matt's aims with these sessions is to just give you some food for thought to take away and really start to tease out and work on for yourselves. And this is an example of that, just to get your brain whirring a little bit around this question of context to figure out how significant it is for your dissertation.
Well, I think if I can kind of
yeah, of course,
jump in, I think again that's one of those really indicative parts of being a master's student and writing at level 7 is considering your positionality to your research in a much more kind of meaningful way.
Yeah.
And thinking about, what can this actually contribute? What can I personally contribute? You know, and because when you're doing a master's, you're more likely to maybe straddle multiple contexts, because you might be a professional who is also conducting research and looking at how these things intersect and making sure you're exploring that in your writing. Yeah, is a really key thing to do.
Yeah. So in terms of where we write about context then, as we mentioned earlier, it can kind of be spread through the project depending on how big a role it plays and how much you feel it's worth giving your time and attention to talking about context. First of all, in the introduction, it's about introducing and telling the story of that research context, really just helping situate the reader in the environment or the community that research problem has emerged from. And I think as well, tracking that through the literature review, thinking about the types of sources that you use, whether any of those are indicative of a certain context. So whether you're grappling with training documents, course books, whether you're looking at the grey literature and policy documents, depending on the context of your project, you'll be pushed to focus on these to various degrees. So it's worth thinking about tracking that through to your lit review. As you mentioned there, really spending some time acknowledging and reflecting on your role in the context and how that might impact your methods. That's something that could be dealt with in the methodology, and Matt's going to talk about that later on. As you come to the discussion, I think it's about being quite open and honest that our perspective is the filter that context passes through. So what I mean by that is that recognizing that we're all individuals in the research process. We all bring baggage, we all bring experience to the research process. And that context passes through that filter. We might see problems where others would see solutions, or we might critique something that we feel is problematic that other researchers haven't questioned, have been more accepting of. So ultimately, we're the ones in our dissertations that mediate the relationship between context and methodology. We're the ones that decide how much impact one has on the other. And I think being as clear as you can about that and really teasing it apart and talking about it in detail in the discussion is well worth doing. It's a great opportunity to be critical, but it's also what's more expected of you at this level as you're pushing towards that more master's level style of writing. Lastly, I've already mentioned, but in the conclusion, you could actually come back to the context as a measure of success. How successful have you been in impacting that context? How successful have you been in meeting your research aims and changing the lives of your participants in some way, for example? So thinking about the contribution that your dissertation makes and its implications, for some, context may be a really useful measure of whether or not you've been successful in that sense. So, as I mentioned, it could be that you scatter this throughout the whole dissertation. There could be different points at which you feel actually you want to give it a little bit more focus. But with this slide, I just really wanted to demonstrate to you that you have got that freedom. This is something that you can talk about in various parts of the dissertation. So don't feel constrained that it has to live only in the introduction. It could be that you come to it later on, for example, in things like the discussion and certainly in the methodology. Okay.
Right. I'm going to take over now and start talking a bit more actually about the methodology section of your dissertations and research projects. But just want to begin by kind of saying I think context is such an important thing, obviously for all the reasons Kirsty discussed, because it comes to inform your theoretical stance, which will inform the way you approach your methodology. And we're going to look at some of that now. So, hold on. So, first of all, I actually want to begin by just really defining what exactly a methodology is. And really, at its core, a methodology is about demonstrating how you've built your project to give you the best possible chance of answering your research questions. So usually at the end of your literature review, you'll come out, you'll have identified a gap, problem, and this will generate research questions, you know, the what you want to find out, what you want to answer. And when you start kind of writing your methodology, like I say, it's about showing that you've really thought about, like, actually going to best answer the research questions I have generated. So this means that methodologies end up being quite personal things, because there's different people might approach answering research questions in different ways. And what I want to stress is there isn't really a right way and a wrong way to write a methodology. There are things that you have to include, but the decisions that you take are very rarely right or wrong. But it's about consistently providing justification for the choices made. And we'll return to this kind of at several points, but it's justification beyond, I think this has more advantages than disadvantages. It needs to tell a cohesive story, much like your entire dissertation or research project tells kind of a consistent narrative. Your methodology needs to do the same. And to do this, you have to kind of show that you've carefully considered the four following things. So you've got your epistemological stance. So this is sometimes referred to as a theoretical stance. And one of the things that we'll also talk about is how definitions are very important in methodologies, because you'll find that authors use terms very interchangeably. And I'm also going to be guilty of that in the next few slides as well. Then you need to show how your particular personal epistemological stance, how that has come to influence your research approach, which some authors will refer to as a methodology and some authors will refer to as a research design. My preferred term is research approach. This is, and I will talk about this again in a few slides, but I think of your research approach as the framework for your research. So it's kind of like the skeleton that you then map your methods onto, because this framework will have an influence on your methods. And then again, you'll have to talk about your methods in detail. You might be just one method, or you might be using multiple methods. And again, reflecting on the advantages, disadvantages, but going beyond that. And we'll talk in the last section of today about how you go about doing that. And finally, ethics. Ethics is a really important part of the methodology that often ends up being a place where people kind of lose marks and fall down because they expect it to be a really paint by numbers exercise where they think they can go away and read the BERA guidelines or whatever your particular kind of ethical guidelines for your discipline are, and say, I read the BERA guidelines and I decided that I would make sure that my participants were protected from harm. I wouldn't expose them to any, particularly sensitive material or whatever. At master's level, that's not quite enough. You need to show nuanced ethical considerations. So an example that I would give is, say, with a piece of educational research, you might need to think about, well, if I do an intervention with a group, is it ethical that only this group receives the benefit? Would it be ethical to have a control group that doesn't receive the benefit? Now, of course, that has knock-on effects for my research. If I don't have a control group, it means I'm less able to make comparisons, certainly in drawing out a causal kind of effect. But I might decide that actually it's not ethically warranted, and that would be unfair and unjust to have one group that receives an intervention and another group that doesn't. And again, you have to spell out your justification for those choices. Obviously, there are some absolute lines in ethics that we never, but some things can be pushed if you can provide sufficient justification. Sometimes deception is necessary within ethics if you're working with human participants, and that can be for a variety of reasons. And again, it's about spelling out that you've thought about that, and also thinking about how you'll mitigate the impact of violating that ethical principle. So one of the things that I would really employ you to do with your ethics is obviously do read the ethical guidelines for your subject area, but then go beyond that. The BERA guidelines contain recommended further reading, for example. I definitely suggest that you go away and explore that in a bit more depth so you can bring a richer level of analysis to your ethical considerations, and you can really show that you've had this kind of sophisticated engagement with the ethical process.
Can I ask a question, Matt, before we go to the next slide?
Absolutely.
How important is the epistemological stance stuff? Because I know I've talked to students before that feel like, they've got their methods, they've got their research approach, and from that they're like, I think I'm probably a relativist. I'm going to talk about that, or I think I'm going to talk about interpretivism. I can't say it. How can you write about the epistemology in a way that feels a bit more meaningful than just kind of ticking boxes? Because that's something that I've struggled to help students with in the past.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. Actually, I think this is where context comes in, because I think context will naturally affect your epistemological or theoretical, we can use those terms relatively interchangeably. It will affect that stance. So if I'm, say, doing my research is rooted in a professional context, but I'm looking specifically at my immediate environment. If I think back to something like when I was doing my teacher training, so for my dissertation there, I was working with a group of year sevens, kind of a low attaining group of year sevens. We were looking at improving their creative writing. So that was rooted in this very professional context, because that was the focus of the research was meant to be small scale intervention. Naturally, my theoretical stance moved towards being something rooted in a more interpretivist approach, because that was appropriate for what I was trying to do. Conversely, say that the context of my research is maybe to try and inform policy or something like that, you might want to work with a much larger data set, because generalizability becomes much more important. But in the case of my dissertation, I wasn't concerned with generalizability. I was concerned with outcomes for this very small group. Therefore, my stance and way of approaching the research was influenced by that.
So I suppose when we write about this in our methodology, often the epistemological stance is one of the first things that you come to.
Yes.
But actually, it's very unusual for you to, off the bat, as you're planning your project, get secure in your epistemological stance and then start to develop methodologies. It sounds like actually when you're thinking through this, it almost happens in reverse.
I would almost absolutely say that is the case. Yeah, you'll sort of reveal this from the process, and when I say your epistemological stance, this isn't like a hard and fast rule that means I am an interpretivist or I am a constructivist or an objectivist or whatever, and that means that you can never do another piece of research or piece of writing from a different perspective.
Yeah,
it's just that depending on your context, you approach things in different ways, and often your epistemological stance might actually reveal itself as you start thinking about your research approach, your methods, thinking about the impact that you want your research to have as well. That then might actually make you realize, well, actually that probably ties up more with interpretivism or something kind of wider scale.
That's really useful then. It feels like it's something that actually emerges the more you think about and engage with your project, the more you start to actually recognize, oh, it's this kind of stance that I seem to be occupying.
Yes. The most important thing is that you provide, again, a consistent justification for what it is that you're saying. So what you don't want to do is say, I am an objectivist, and then you decide that your methodology is going to be grounded theory, and you're going to do kind of singular instances of structured interviews or something like that. You don't want to have confusion. It should make consistent sense across your methodology.
Right. Cool.
But yes, you might actually find that you benefit from actually writing about your epistemological stance actually towards the end of your methodology, and not in terms of where you would actually structure it in the writing, but you might find it easier to start your writing with, say, your research design, research approach, write about your methods, ethics, and then come back to write your epistemological stance. That might actually be more kind of clarified for you then.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
So this figure, I've borrowed it from a really good paper by an author called Crotty, and it highlights the relationship that we sort of began talking about there, and also shows why definitions are really important, because Crotty uses the term methodology to refer to what I would call a research design, research approach. But what I kind of want to illustrate from this is your epistemology and theoretical perspective, your epistemology generally feeds into your theoretical perspective. And your theoretical perspective there, we're often talking about positivism, or maybe you're looking at from critical feminist theory, ecological theory, whatever your perspective is. And then that will have an influence on your methodology. Because if you're a positivist, for example, you're probably not going to adopt grounded theory as your methodology or research approach, because they don't really share a relationship. And unfortunately, as much as I'd love to go through all of these distinctions, we don't have enough time here. But for anyone who is interested in looking at those distinctions in great detail, I've got kind of plenty of reading recommendations around that. And research approach, this framework, will influence your methods that you then use. So if you say you adopt as your research approach or methodology, as Crofty calls it, an experimental design, then you'll probably be collecting data in a lab. If you adopt a case study approach, it's likely that you'll then gravitate towards a collection of qualitative methods. So it's about thinking about this step-down relationship. But as kind of Kirsty was just saying, and we were just talking about, sometimes you might not actually realize what your epistemological stance is until you've done the rest of the writing. There's a good chance you'll have an idea of your theoretical perspective, because quite often that can be dictated by the discipline that you find yourself in. For example, until very recently, an overwhelming majority of psychology approached everything from a positivistic perspective. It's only kind of recently that there's been a growing trend towards shifting away from that. Educational research, especially when it's being conducted by teachers in kind of real settings, tends to be approached from a kind of interpretive perspective. So you might already have that kind of dictated for you. But also, again, as a master's student, you do have the position, you do have power to kind of shift your position, because that might be one of the things that's unique about your project. Again, you're not wrong. You just have to show that you've thought about that in the literature, and you've got a justification from the literature for why you're making that choice. So as a kind of, we've talked about this a little bit, but defining your epistemological stance can be really confusing, because if you just Google define epistemology, there are so many different variations. So, for example, I Googled it, and the top one on Google is epistemology is ways of knowing and nature of knowledge. But that's not the definition I've used in various different write-ups. And again, it's not necessarily wrong. It doesn't mean that the definition that I've written down here from Google is the most right one, but it's really important that when you're writing up your methodology, you do define what you mean by epistemology and then spell out your position. And it's important to read around and choose perspectives and definitions that make the most sense to you, because this is very, very abstract. This is kind of, philosophy of knowledge, the nature of knowledge, and you want to write something that is clear and helps to clarify the rest of your approach. So like I say, do lots of reading and find the definitions that work, make the most sense to you.
I think that's a really important point to make, actually, because I think often when we come to this fairly new to research, it feels like the answers are all out there and set in stone. So in other words, it's almost like there is a uniform definition of what it means to be an interpretivist. It's out there. Actually, there's no agreement, is there, in terms of what that means? There's different definitions, different schools of thought on it. So as you say, a lot of it's about understanding your position and which ones make most sense to you, as opposed to there's one truth that you're trying to figure out in those definitions. Yeah.
And again, relating that back to your context, you'll often find your context comes to play at that. You know, again, relating it back to educational research, I think it's very logical that it's often rooted in interpretivism, because you're working in these kind of, every classroom is kind of a dynamic slice of time. It's kind of its own unique environment where you've got the intersection of different students with all these different backgrounds, and so many factors feed into that it almost feels kind of obtuse to try and apply an objectivist kind of approach to researching those kinds of situations. So yeah, context is everything. Then once you've clarified kind of this theoretical and epistemological stance, like I say, you come to your research approach, or what Crotty calls methodology, what I call a research approach. You sometimes hear it referred to as a research design, but it's the framework, or what I've called here a strategy of inquiry. And it is really important because it starts to get you thinking about not only the methods that you'll use to collect your data, but the type of data that you're going to collect. So this is where you'll start to think about, is my project going to be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed? You'll start thinking about the duration of your project. Some of these frameworks, it's particularly important to kind of specify a length of time. Like, one of the key characteristics of a case study approach is that it is bounded. It has a boundary. It will last for a particular amount of time. Action research, for example, it's suggested that you do at least 3 cycles of action research. So it can start to help give you a sense of how long your project will go on for, how much data you actually want to collect, and also importantly, kind of for you guys, also knowing when to stop, which can be really important as well, because you don't want to kind of over collect data. And yeah, knowing where the boundary is really key. Also, it starts to get you thinking about the nature of the claims that you're going to be able to make from your findings. So this is also influenced kind of by the methods that you choose. But if you, say, adopt something like a case study approach, well, the whole point of a case study is that you're looking at a very specific instance of whatever it is that you're interested in. Then when it comes to write your discussion, that means that you're not going to be able to make huge claims to generalizability, and the findings, your data isn't going to be particularly reliable, but it will be very valid, and you may have a very rich and deep understanding of this specific instance. Conversely, if you choose to do something experimental, you might be able to establish a cause and effect relationship, which has greater claims to generalizability. You might be able to apply things more widely from that. So that's a really important thing that I would say the research design framework, research approach, whatever you choose to call it, and again, that definition is going to be up to you to decide, is probably the most important part, because it makes a lot of other things fall into place. Didn't know if, Kirsty, there was anything you wanted to say before.
No, I'm just nodding and agreeing with everything you're saying.
Cool. Melissa, do I have any recommended literature to follow? Yes. Can we get yes? The answers to these questions are absolutely. I can as much as I feel like I've sort of slightly attacked Crotty for his different definition of research approach. The Crotty paper is excellent, so I'll see if I can link that one out to you guys, because I think it's a really good one that kind of breaks things down, and also he spends some time talking about the distinction between epistemology and theoretical stances, so that's worth considering. And I can think of a couple of other papers as well. So yeah, yeah, if I can find them quickly, I might be able to post them at the end. Otherwise, we can upload them to the LibGuide.
Yeah. Oh, we could put them in the email later on as well, so we don't have to do it right now. But we can get them to you so that they're there in that email and on the guide. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Cool. So now thinking about our research methods, this is a really important part as well, and will end up being quite a lengthy part of your methodology, because this is the kind of tools of actually how are you going to collect your data? How am I actually going to go out and get the information that I will then analyze, which I will then use to draw findings, conclusions, write up my discussion. And it's really important that you think about what I've called here the push and pull of research methods. And what I mean by that, there is no perfect research method. It would be wonderful if there were, but every research method has a collection of advantages and disadvantages. But reflecting on that means going beyond just listing the advantages of interviews are this and the disadvantages of interviews are this. It's about exploring what that means for your project and then building in that justification for your chosen method. It's about acknowledging that, for example, semi-structured interviews can sometimes, there is a risk of going off piste and the respondents starting to talk about things that aren't actually related to your research questions. However, you might think that is justified because actually you think that because maybe you're writing about a sensitive topic and you think that following a rigid structure might inhibit participant responses. Again, there's no wrong method. So the example I've picked here, is why have you picked participant observations over non-participant observations? And refer back to your research questions. When you're providing that justification, make an explicit reference to that. This would be a useful method to adopt because it would enable me to answer research question 1 because. And again, it shows that justification, it shows that thought process, and it demonstrates your understanding of this relationship between your research questions, your methodology.
I think as well, sometimes we kind of have justification and explanation of our methods, but sometimes the proof is also then from the findings that you generate. So I suppose, once you come into the discussion, you can almost then reflect back. And again, if we're thinking about sort of reflecting on the success of our projects, if you've generated that data, that in itself is also a secondary thread to kind of help prove and help justify those research methods were kind of the best approach, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I
think another string to your bow almost, isn't it, having those results?
I probably should have said as well that when you're writing your methodology, we still need to really hold on to that hedging language that we've talked about before. When you're talking about how these limitations, these drawbacks could affect your research, still use your hedging language. This could impact the research by X, Y, Z, because then when you actually come to write your discussion, you've actually got your findings, you might be able to park some of that hedging language because you'll actually know what the answer is. That kind of building off what you said there, I think that there's definitely that kind of relationship.
Yeah.
You have to show an awareness of the limitations of your methods, and some of the things to think about in terms of that is how your limitations could affect your findings, and that's thinking about relating it to things like the applicability of your findings, ways that your data might be compromised because of the collection method. If you use questionnaires, for example, and you've mainly used closed questions, you might like to discuss how you could limiting participant answers, for example. You should also talk about how you've tried to account for these limitations. Is there something that you've done to I don't know, if you've decided to do participant observations and you've correctly identified that there is a researcher sort of bias effect where your presence is likely to change the behavior of the people in the setting. What are you going to do to try and account for that? Is there anything you can do? And in some cases, it's about talking about why you actually don't think those limitations are relevant to your project. So as many of you will know, I'm currently kind of writing up, I was discussing this at the beginning, what has now become a research proposal, but I've proposed to use participant observations, and I've actually highlighted that I believe that the observer bias effect would actually be a strength of this piece of research, because my epistemological stance is rooted in interpretivism, and I believe that everything that is important and valuable that will come out of the project is revealed the unique interactions that arise between everyone who's involved, whether they're a researcher or a participant. So in that way, I'm demonstrating that we've taken this limitation, showing that you have the knowledge, the awareness of it, but saying it's actually not relevant to this project because, and again, providing that justification. In a different project that was seeking to make different claims to generalizability and applicability, that could be a really big problem. And that author would have to find a different way to address that, or potentially adopt a different method to kind of collect that data. So again, that kind of reinforces this idea that it's a very personal thing to you and personal to your project, but it's about showing that there's consistency and you've thought about how it all fits together.
I think that's a really good point, actually. I think, we can look at a methodology or a method in its generic sense, and we can find generic limitations that the literature puts forwards. But then actually in the context and looking at our project, what we want to achieve, who we're working with, that limitation, as you were just describing with yours, it can be kind of flipped on its head, and you can say, well, actually, granted, this generic methodology has this limitation, but in the context of my project, I actually don't think that's the case, and here's why, and then you go through the explanation.
That's a difference between an undergraduate and master's level project.
Yeah.
Because it's about showing that you've gone beyond just reading the literature and these kind of static facts and start thinking about, but actually, what does that mean in the context of my project?
Yeah.
Why does that matter? And always starting out with a good introductory textbook is always a really good place to begin.
Yeah.
Because that's going to give you the foundational knowledge about those different research methods. But the bit where you kind of do the master's thing is where you start thinking about that in relation to your personal project.
I think you get very selfish, don't you, at master's level? You feel a little bit like it's all me, but that's a good thing. I think you need to talk about all the time, bring it back to your project, your stance, how it impacts your design. Yeah.
I really think you do. I think, when it comes to a master's project, you're in that position where you get to kind of make a small contribution on kind of that sphere of knowledge. You have the opportunity to change the shape of the sphere of knowledge in the tiniest way, but still it's there, which means you do need to be thinking about that. So we've got a couple of examples of research methods here. So I'm going to talk about semi-structured interviews, and then Kirsty is going to talk to you about artifact analysis briefly.
Yep.
I have no idea what artifact analysis is. Help. But yes, thinking about some of the things that you need to explain when talking about that particular method. So if I choose to use semi-structured interviews, one of my methods. So let's say we're talking about this hypothetical kind of case study. I've adopted a case study approach. So I'm using several methods, and one of the methods I've chosen is structured group interviews. So the questions I'm going to need to think about, I'm going to need to explain why I haven't chosen structured or unstructured interviews. And that doesn't need to be really lengthy, because you'll realize that you'll lose a lot of your word count if you spend too long on that. You do need to demonstrate to your marker that you considered those alternatives, and you can kind of quickly reject them. They're not suitable because. Another really key thing here is, why group interviews? What are reasons for kind of adopting that approach rather than interviewing participants one-to-one? One of the things I would say here is, don't be afraid to also talk about some practical reasons within that. Sometimes it might be that, the group interview, it might be because the participant group that you're working with, for example, are difficult to access, and maybe you're going to a support group or something like that, and therefore it's much easier to work with the group as a whole. They might feel comfortable participating as a group. So it's about thinking, again, it's in relation to everything else within your methodology as well. Also, it might be because there are very specific reasons that you want the group dynamic, that you're interested in the interactions between group members, and that's something that you feel would be lost in one-to-one interviews. Obviously, you need to think about those limitations associated with adopting that approach. What are the disadvantages for, say, adopting a group interview, and how are you trying to reduce the impact of this? Are you going to try and reduce the impact of this? If you're not going to, why not? How does that relate back to your research question? How does it meet the aims of your project? And that's why I've said here, could the limitations be an advantage? Kind of like in the example I just gave from my own project, where I've kind of flipped the disadvantage of participant observations and said, but actually in this project, I think it's advantageous because of what I want to achieve. And that's something to really look out for, because you might realize that some of these disadvantages, especially in interpretivist kind of projects that tend to be using approaches like case studies, grounded theory, you might find that these listed limitations that are facts, actually, when you think about them for your project, can actually be advantageous and kind of be useful and strengthen your argument. And when you come to write your discussion, kind of strengthen your conclusion. And also just thinking about the literature that you've used to inform these decisions, and the way that literature has informed how you constructed your interview schedule, for example. That's getting a bit more practical, but that's about thinking about how did I choose the words that I would use in my questions, the type of questions I would use. So methodologies should be, peppered with references, much like your literature review. You should have the voice of other authors that have used similar methods, similar approaches. For the definitions, you're going to want to have references throughout as well. So it's really important that your marker can still see that every decision that you're taking is still informed by the research literature. This still hasn't moved into kind of a piece of writing where you're saying, well, I felt that this would be appropriate. It needs to be theoretically motivated. And if that is that, your stance is that it felt appropriate and in line with your epistemological position, that is still ultimately motivated by literature. So that's something really important to kind of keep in mind throughout the whole process. So that's kind of everything that I've got to kind of say about that. So I'll hand over to you, Kirsty.
Okay, so I was going to talk about artifact analysis. I'm just going to jump us back to the research framework model, just so that we can remind ourselves what this relates to. So artifact analysis is where we kind of come to methods such as content and discourse analysis, conversation analysis, where we're picking apart kind of existing data and looking at how people communicate, literary critique, so using novels and things like that to kind of pull them apart and try to get some kind of theoretical, thematic understanding of them. Also under here, you'll see things like visual methods. The thing to think about with artifact analysis is that word artifact, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. And artifact analysis is the kind of research that I love and have done lots of. And yeah, it kind of does relate to this, Francis, actually, looking at research using media. When we usually think about an artifact, we kind of think of archaeologists kind of digging things up. They find an artifact, they maybe find a bracelet or a vase, and they use that physical object to try and understand the lives of the people that used it, or the culture or the context that it emerged from. If you're working with any kind of a secondary medium, so it could be a YouTube video, it could be a film, it could be a novel that someone has written, it could be a policy document, that's an artifact. That is a physical or a textual representation of a moment in time, of a culture, of a context, of an individual. And I think that term artifact is really interesting, because in terms of our research methods, it can help us to connect what otherwise feels like a very kind of individual thing. So like these YouTube videos that Francis mentions, if we think of a YouTube video as an artifact, that allows us to start to give it that human dimension. That YouTube video was created at a certain point in time from a historical context. The creator brought their own baggage to it. They've got their own lived experiences. That person making the YouTube video is perhaps thinking about, well, how do I use this video as a form of activism? How do I use it as a form of persuasion? Do I use it as an information tool? So we can approach these different forms of media. As I say, they're almost like these artifacts that they kind of, when we start to pick them apart, we start to see all the context and all the human dimensions that sit behind them. I get quite excited about this because my PhD was all about this. How are novels artifacts of trauma is basically what I talked about. When people are under pressure, people experience trauma. What draws them to write fictions and novels and creative writing? And how do those novels and those texts become an artifact, when we start chipping away at all the dirt and all the old paint on the surface, what experiences does it kind of reveal underneath? That's where my love of this stuff comes from. Questions to ask if you're working with this kind of document. So the example I've given here is again inspired by a student I was talking to this week. So you could be doing an artifact analysis. You could be looking at some training documents and training materials for newly qualified social workers. And what are some of the questions that we can ask about that method of content analysis of looking at these documents? Well, first of all, again, thinking about the role of the artifact, what context do those documents function in the real world? So you've got them as this kind of static, dusty kind of piece of text, but outside of that, what functions do they have? Who do they impact and how are they used in real life? And you might also need to question how sure you can be about that. Are you a newly qualified social worker? Who's telling you that that's how they're used? Are they used like that all the time? So again, picking apart the nuances of this sort of stuff and thinking about how sure can we be about a context being 100% fixed. Also then think about the methods and the approach to content analysis that you use. It's very unlikely that you can do an entire analysis. You will probably have to cherry pick and focus in on certain dimensions. Think about why that's the case. Justify your focus in terms of the focus of that analysis, but also think about what's the basis for that in the literature. Is there a single source of academic literature that's giving you that method and giving you that way through the literature? Or have you created an approach from various sources? Again, this is about, do you need to justify your synthesis? Do you need to justify the intersection when you said, I'm going to use this, this, and this, and that forms my research approach? Also, again, always question, how does this form of analysis answer your research questions? I think with any kind of artifact analysis, a critique you might often get is, why is it not more active? Why did you not talk to participants, generate your own data? Why are you working with secondary sources? And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about the positives, the pros of that approach and what it enables you to do that might not otherwise be possible. Also allows you to think about how you will measure success, the criteria that you set yourself, and how you will know by the end of that dissertation that you have written a successful piece of artifact analysis. As Matt mentioned, thinking about what are the limitations of this approach, and then thinking about the strengths and how we can flip some of those limitations on their heads. So artifact analysis may carry with it certain limitations. It may not have practical implications. It may be quite kind of devolved from the real world. But if that's not your remit and scope, if that's not what you're reaching for with this artifact analysis, then actually we could possibly push that limitation to one side, because although interesting, it's perhaps not 100% relevant to this type of dissertation. Inclusion and exclusion criteria is well worth thinking about as you do that. I think at an undergraduate level, inclusion and exclusion criteria, as Francis has asked here, is used in a very practical sense of how did I find literature. I think you, in terms of inclusion and exclusion, you want to dig a little bit deeper and be able to really justify it from linking it to those methods and that epistemological stance. So usually I would expect inclusion and exclusion criteria in an undergrad dissertation to be things like, I used English language sources, I looked at literature from the last 5 years, blah, blah, blah. In a master's dissertation, I would expect you to be thinking about, as Matt was talking about, that sort of more philosophical stance, how that's enshrined in your aims and ethos as a researcher, and how that has led you to your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it's always thinking of it as part of that bigger whole, as opposed to just, I kind of chose this for convenience sake. I think sometimes, unfortunately, that's true. We do pick them, but I think, Matt, you need to like connect it to something bigger. You can't just say, oh, I did this because it's easy. I did this because of COVID. There's got to be that wider thinking as well, so you can justify it. Yeah. So yeah, it's hard because obviously we keep talking about this methodology and this bit that you write in your dissertations as this sort of huge beast, but actually, if you chip away at it bit by bit, it will all start to make sense. I think you come out of the haze and things start to fit together, don't they?
Very much so. Yeah, very, very much so.
Okay, so did you want to add anything else to that, Matt, before we kind of tie everything together?
No, I don't think so. I found the readings that I was hoping to find, so I can share those with people, which is good.
Oh, brilliant. Do you want to pop them in the chat, or shall we do it in the email later on?
What would people prefer? I mean, I can share it now, and then we can also put it in the email as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send the permalinks from the library gateway, and then we'll pop it in the email as well.
Brill. Okay, we'll do that then to everyone. We'll just stick it in with the slides, and everyone can have them. Yeah. Brilliant. So we've somehow arrived at 20 past 4. So just to kind of tie all this together, Matt, I don't know if you want to say anything about this recommended reading that you've selected for this session.
Yeah. This is just, I think, the best introductory kind of research textbook ever. And I have recommended it to, frankly, an ungodly number of students. And I've seen it crop up then as references in their kind of dissertations and things like that. And I've still use it very regularly. It's kind of a really good example of that kind of starting point that I was talking about. And this is one that isn't too kind of, this one doesn't get too bogged down in like epistemology and stuff like that. It's not a great textbook for that, but it's really good for giving an overview of kind of commonly used social research kind of project methods, a really good starting point in to get you thinking about things, and then supplying further reading for you to develop from there. So that's a permalink that you can click on, and you can follow it through to that. And that's the most recent edition that's available through the library, so you can read it all online. Yeah, really, really worthwhile spending some time reading that textbook. I think it clarifies a lot of useful things.
That's brilliant. So yeah, that'll be included in the slides, as you can see, like Matt says. Click that for the permalink, and then there'll also be the additional resources that will pop in that email as well. In terms of kind of an online task that we'd like you to kind of follow up with after this session, really it's just to ask for your feedback on future sessions. This is the last session that we'd kind of planned into our schedule when we first planned all of these back in May, and we're actually now looking ahead to July and August. So we've got some ideas about what future sessions could include, but we'd really love to hear from you about what sessions you would find most helpful. So when you receive the slides, if you can just follow that link there that says feedback on future sessions, it literally takes 60 seconds. It's just a 2-question feedback form asking, first of all, what topics do you want us to cover in sessions in July and August? And also, are there any formats that you would find useful? So, you know, do you want some PDF downloads? Do you want some online interactive content? What works for you as a learner? So if you could fill that out just a couple of minutes after the session, we're going to pull that into our planning for the next couple of months and make sure that we're running sessions that fit the things that you're looking for. In terms of a next session, it's a HIT session that we're running on Thursday the 25th, which is next week. That'll be at 2 o'clock. So if you are getting to a stage now where you're starting to put pen to paper, you're starting to draft some writing, then please do join us for the HIT session. We've got a couple of bookings already, but we'd love to see more people at that session, make a bit of progress and building some momentum into our writing next Thursday. Okay, so that's everything that we wanted to cover. I think that's all the content from the slides. We finished a little bit early, so of course Matt and I will stick around. If you've got any questions for us, pop those in the chat and we're more than happy to answer them. And then at the end of the day, once we've kind of closed down the session, I'll get those slides and those links through to you. Okay, all right then, take care everyone, see you later.